Morning, this is Bishop John with a homily from Friar Doc for the 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The Old Testament reading is taken from the Book of Wisdom, chapter 2, verses 12 and then 17 through 20. The responsorial verses are from Psalm 54, verses 3 and 4, and then 5, and then 6 and 8. The epistle reading is from James, chapter 3, verse 16 through chapter 4, verse 3. And the gospel is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. I urge you to read them all when you get a chance here. This morning, the readings all teach us something about dealing with the facts that, one, there is evil in the world, and two, even people we respect and love can think and do things that are evil. When we embrace the world of power and control, we turn away from God and we lose contact with Him. We make a habit, actually, of serving the dark Lord and coming up with all sorts of explanations for why it is entirely appropriate that we do so. The people in this camp, this world of power and control, are indifferent to many things, but they are not tolerant if we defy them. They are most definitely not tolerant of different ideas and motivations. And they are particularly dangerous for people of faith and conscience. If they know who and what we followers of the way are, that is, committed to serving God, serving His sheep, and not controlling them, they will come after us with a vengeance. They want instead to strip away from our minds and hearts the relationship we have with our Abba and our Messiah. They want all of us to say and do what is consistent with their commands, to join with them in serving power and might, or they will do everything they can to silence, humiliate, control, and subjugate us. These people strip their adversaries of their status as human beings and redefine them as subhuman, and so not worthy of any kind of respect. Any non-trivial disagreement with them immediately engenders personal, that is, ad hominem, attacks. Discussion or debate with them becomes useless. It doesn't matter what labels they carry or what they call themselves, because they're in all places. They're both in the churches and outside of them. They aren't using a manual teaching benign philanthropy for all of this. They're really just using a spiritual cookbook, to borrow something from Damon Knight's 1950 short story, To Serve Man. When these people make grand and glorious statements about serving mankind according to their enlightened and high-minded vision, they're really just talking about subjugating and devouring the rest of us, about enslaving our spirits and imprisoning our souls. Ultimately, there is no truth in them. There is no security or peace in what they offer. The first reading today is taken from chapter 2 of the Book of Wisdom, of the Wisdom of Solomon, written in about 50 BC in Alexandria, down in old Pharaoh's land. The particular verses describe some devious sleazeballs plotting to destroy the one who is righteous and just. The minions of the evil one plot against the righteous one because he is annoying to them and because he calls them out for breaking the law and violating their own earlier training in verse 12. They want to see whether his words be true and what will happen to him in the end, verse 17. They figure, if the righteous one is the Son of God, God will help him and deliver him from the hand of his foes, verse 18. They propose, however, to test him with violence and torture, to try his patience and to see whether he will give them proof of his gentleness, verse 19. The verses are about our Messiah, Yeshua ben Yosef. They will condemn him to a shameful death because, according to his own words, God will take care of him, verse 20. They don't seriously think the righteous one is the Son of God, and they don't think God will save him. They just want to be rid of the man. After the exhortation to love wisdom and seek righteousness throughout chapter 1, its last verse introduces the wicked, who are the ones who reject life and choose death, as it says in Deuteronomy 30:19. Beginning in chapter 2, they see nothing but randomness in their fortunes and trouble in their lives. They believe there is no divine order, that nothing comes from God, and so they should enjoy what pleasures they can out of their meaningless lives until they are snuffed out. They can oppress and persecute anyone over whom they have some power. That is, they believe that might makes right, and the elites make whatever rules they want. In these verses, they are angered by any who march to the beat of a different drum, one that is moral and comes from God, the Torah. And they'll do whatever they can to humiliate and destroy them. This enmity applies to anyone who is obvious about living a righteous and God-fearing life in opposition to the mob. But for us followers of the way, it applies in spades and spectacularly to Jesus Christ. Essentially, a millennium before he walked the earth, the Messiah's mission was clearly not understood by those who were, and still are, his enemies. They're acting like our Lord is a teacher's pet of some kind who can be attacked and even killed when no one is looking. These kinds of aggression still occur wherever followers of the way stand out against the background of sleazy, dishonest, and shameful crowds firmly ensconced in a corrupt society of liars, thieves, and thugs. Such societies always self-destruct, by the way, but their minions always fall back, regroup, and begin infiltrating any of the more scrupulous and honorable organizations and governments that replace them. Sometimes it takes hundreds of years, but they find every little chink in the armor and slip in through it to kill off the principles of human service to God they so hate. How do we followers of the way identify and confront the standing stones of the world? Do we recognize when so many of our peers are worshiping false gods? It is sometimes difficult for us to admit what is obviously evil from the perspective our Lord offers us. We call this kind of thing brutal honesty, and it applies to everyone in our lives. Ourselves, those we love, and those who are more distant. It isn't the appearance of things to which we should owe our allegiance, but to the reality that is God's, and that we can see only through eyes endowed with wisdom, eyes that look for him in all things, rely on his grace, and so discriminate truthfully. The verses from Psalm 54 ask for help from God and then acknowledge that that help has actually been forthcoming. In the first two verses here, verses 3 and 4, David pleads with God for divine intervention to save him because proud and ruthless, godless men, the minions of King Saul, as we know from 1 Samuel 23:19, want him dead. Verse 5. Clearly, having been rescued, or at least overcoming his fear, he reaffirms his faith that God is my helper and sustains my life. Verse 6. And that he will offer Yahweh sacrifice and praise his name for its goodness. Verse 8. Jubilant and overwhelmingly grateful, David knows God has saved him and will protect him. In the end, every one of us ought to say with David, the Lord upholds my life. Verse 6 again. King David was betrayed by some folks he trusted, and he was on the lam here. By now, he wasn't going to get along, going along to get along, and he wasn't pretending anymore that King Saul just didn't understand how good he was, or how good he'd been. He took time to thank God for protecting him in situations he knew he shouldn't have survived. He was still free, and he was certain God would continue to help him. It should be the same with us. We love our Abba because we know he will help us, whether we know exactly how or not, just as he always has done for his faithful children. He shows us his love, and it is simply right that if we have an honest relationship with him, it is right for us to love him back and trust that his salvation for us will unfold in due time. In the verses from the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4 of the Epistle of James, we are told how much we have to get our egos out of the way to build, with God's grace, of course, a world in which we ask for our Abba's help correctly. James points out that where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every foul practice, verse 3:16. And that wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without inconstancy or insincerity, verse 3:17. He recommends we Christians keep our emotions under control because the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace, verse 3:18. Then he asks where the wars and conflicts among us come from, and makes the answer clear. It is from your passions that make war within your members, verse 4:1. We covet but do not possess, kill and envy but cannot obtain, fight and wage war, but we possess nothing because we do not ask, verse 4:2. Finally, we ask but do not receive because in our passions we demand what we think we have a right to have, and therefore we ask wrongly, verse 4:3. James' point here is well taken. Real leaders, those who truly lead the nations, so to speak, cannot afford to stroke their egos and forget about serving God. If they do, the only results they'll get will wind up fouling the environment, rotting whatever virtue there might be among the people, and devastating the souls who have trusted them. The road they travel down is one of death, one of power and combat and death. Ultimately, it offers only dissolution, dissatisfaction, and disease, and as I said, death. The rest of us ought to be wise enough not to follow such people, not to make excuses for them or pretend they aren't sick. But there you go. When they tell us what we want to hear and we nod approvingly, it's pretty much true we're also sick. On the other hand, there is a softness of spirit and a gentle humor surrounding Christians who work in the garden of the Lord. They provide comfort to everyone around them, including the weary and the disturbed. There is a certainty and a peace about those who've made a habit of approaching our Abba and our Messiah with love, with trust, humility, and prayer. The virtuous among us, those who've responded to God's grace and made a habit of opening themselves to his call, receive answers to their prayers because they're wise enough not to demand impatiently, but instead to ask rightly. They go simply where the grace of God leads them, verse 4:3 again. This isn't rocket science. This is what it means for us to choose life and prosperity rather than despair and death. Deuteronomy 30:14 through 19. It's our choice. In the reading from chapter 9 of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus reinforces the importance of turning to our Abba with humble service in mind and not with hopes of honor and glory. Jesus and his disciples went on kind of a covert road trip through Galilee in verse 30, where he was teaching them and telling them, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, he will rise. Verse 31. They didn't understand, but they were afraid to question him in verse 33. And so they argued among themselves along the way. When they reached the house in Capernaum, our Lord asked them what the argument was about. Verse 33. They didn't answer him because they had been discussing who among them would be the greatest. Verse 34. Jesus knew what they'd been talking about anyway, and so he delivered some pointed and probably unwelcome instruction to them. If anyone wishes to be first, he said, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all. Verse 35. In addition, lest they concentrate too much on the high and mighty, he took a child and placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around it, he clarified what was most important. Verse 36. He said, whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. Verse 37. The whole issue of the nature of true Christian discipleship, true Christian leadership, came to a head here. Jesus wasn't speaking to the crowds in this case, but only to those who would be the leaders of his church. Their focus had been on whom among them would be the most honored or powerful when Jesus established his kingdom. And it was the wrong focus. He spoke specifically to the 12 and made it clear they were to care for all people as his children. They had to understand the needs of the faithful as if they were children given into their care. They needed to think about things not as human beings do, but as God thinks, just as our Lord told Peter when he rebuked him in Matthew 16:23. In most of our organizations, whether hierarchical or not, we think of leadership going hand in hand with power instead of service. Our politicians and government functionaries are fond of calling themselves public servants, but their actions and the results of their policies suggest they are more focused on serving themselves and being masters of the public. In George Orwell's Animal Farm, they are the pigs in the barnyard and more equal than the rest of us. And I include soldiers in the trenches and first responders in what I've called the rest of us. Even as the fallible human beings they are, those who are actually serving the rest of us have forgotten orders of magnitude more about service to others than the powerful, hypocritical sleazeballs who only serve themselves. The evil in our world isn't overcome or reduced by glib tongues pretending that it isn't there, or that it is actually just a misunderstanding in the family. It is not kind or caring to pretend that the sickness in one's body, mind, or spirit is perfectly all right or otherwise excusable. It helps no one when we go about our lives as enablers and codependents. It is overcome by virtuous and selfless actions, all of it in service to our Master and caring for his sheep as we apply the golden rule in the world around us with a little God-given wisdom. We become wise and virtuous simply by clamping down on our egos, looking around to see what needs to be done, and being open to the still small voice of God as we act to make things better however we can, and being open to, in any case, we can't do this without relying on the grace of God, and remembering that we are called as servants of the Master and not as masters of servants. We aren't called to be rulers of the world. Jesus Christ is the true ruler of the world, of the heavens and the earth, and of all that is seen and unseen. We are called to be followers of the way, which in its truest sense means we are called to be servants, to care for and nurture our brothers and sisters, and not to be kings ordering them about. After he shared a breakfast of fish and bread with the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, the risen Lord told Peter to tend my sheep in John 21:16. He was speaking to all of us. God bless you and yours and keep you.